Good morning and welcome. Today we're having a conversation about the topic of moral certainty. And we have two lovely folks here from the SEED COC on the call today. Would you like to introduce yourselves a little bit?
Yeah, Jennifer, do you want to go first?
Sure, I can go first. I'm Jennifer Damashek. So the SEED COC started because I invited Vanessa and a couple of other people into what we call the community of care. So the COC and SEED COC stands for Community of Care. The SEED COC has been in existence now for a couple of years, and we have been developing structures and processes for what we are calling communities of care, which are basically small groups of people who get to know each other very well with the goal of supporting each other in our lives and also working on projects that are meaningful to everybody. So we envision communities of care being established around certain topics or certain projects or certain values. And so the SEED COC was formed with that in mind. And the main purpose of our community of care is to support other communities of care in forming and in their activities, or they could also be just small groups of people who are doing similar things, who are in intimate relationships with each other, with the intention of supporting each other. So, and I live in the United States, in the state of Maine. What my background is for the past 20 years, I've been homeschooling my two children. They are now adults. And so now my husband and I have the time and space to work on projects that we've been wanting to work on for a long time. And one of them is communities of care.
Thank you, Jennifer. And we also have Vanessa on the call today.
Yeah, thank you, Mistress. Hi, I'm Vanessa. And I was invited by Jennifer and Robert to join the community of care, I think 1.5, 2 years ago. And that was an exciting time. It was a time of change. I've had more than a decade in the working world. I've worked in the for-profit sector, the non-profit sector, for growth, degrowth, all the different areas there, and just found that everywhere where I went, something was missing, and also some dynamics just didn't work out for me, and there was a lot about it in personal growth and in the way how people related to each other. And then speaking with Jennifer and her husband, we realized very quickly that we both had similar stories. We all had similar stories, and wanted to work on a new way of relating to each other, a new way of enabling each other as human beings, through care, through mutual care, and realized how much that has to do with personal growth and how we relate to each other. And that's how we came to this topic we're talking about today.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. We're Mastress. We're a worker organizer of the Workers Revolutionary Collected. And we've been invited today to be a part of this conversation about moral certainty, or this idea that we can carry a high probability of intuition about what's going to happen and the way that it affects how we move through relationships and conversations. Would you introduce a little bit more moral certainty and why it was important for us to be having this conversation today for the CCOC?
Sure, I think I can address that. So one of the things that we wanted to do in creating communities of care, and first of all, with our community of care and our relationships, was think about what's in the way of forming these kinds of relationships that we want to have. And we realized that one of the things that seems to come up in relationships is what we are calling moral certainty. It can be called many things, and it takes, I think, kind of subtle different forms, but it's basically the idea that human beings often have the sense that they are sure and certain about what is right and what is wrong. For example, during the pandemic, some people really knew that it was right to take the vaccine, and other people knew that it was not right. And it caused problems in society. It divided people. It divided people in families. People would get upset with each other. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about and see if we could proactively find a way to deal with this before it came up, that we might have a higher chance of success in keeping our relationships supportive and caring while still allowing this to happen, because it's going to happen. Like, saying that we're going to not have this happen really is not an option. It's going to come up when human beings form relationships with each other at some point. So we wanted to find a way to be able to navigate this together in caring relationships. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Vanessa, or expand.
Yeah, I think one thing that was guiding us along the way were our values as well. So we established before anything else, before doing anything else, we established our values in our community. So we said we are very committed to each other in this community, in the work that we do, but also personally. And above everything else stood our values of kindness, care, love, and relationship. And we came to the topic of moral certainty and how to deal with it, not just through painful experiences in the past or knowing what we don't want, because it's always so easy to know what you don't want, but actually questioning, what do we want then? If we don't want that, what do we want? And we wanted a way to navigate this because we knew we can't avoid it. Moral certainty is something that is just there. Everyone is a different person. Everyone has different opinions, and people genuinely believe in their opinions and, have often good intentions or clear intentions. Not always, but often. And the idea was, how can we navigate this? And what are the agreements we have in our community? Because every community might have different agreements, and navigating topics like moral certainty are dependent on these agreements. When are we stepping out of integrity with them, and when are we in integrity? And I think that helped us to establish processes to navigate it, at least for us. And we realized that this can actually support other people, whilst knowing that navigating moral certainty, as in being or co-being with each other, despite having different opinions or different worldviews, doesn't necessarily mean we agree on everything the other person says, and definitely doesn't mean it goes to a level of allowing people to do harm. So I think there is also an aspect of navigating healthy boundaries there. And I found that so interesting because it's often seen as such a black and white thing, really. Either, you're righteous, but if you're not, and that's often a trap in activism I saw as well in my years as activist, that righteousness. Either you're right about a topic and you fight for that, or you're just agreeing with all the wrongdoings in the world. And what I was missing was this sweet space in between. And that is what we're trying to work out in the community of care. And I find that very exciting.
So we're hearing that in this context, moral certainty is rather than carrying personal beliefs and opinions that guide you through your actions in the world that allow you to like navigate other people doing the same thing. Moral certainty is more taking an absolution or a position of absolution in your thoughts or your opinions that doesn't leave space for other people to be navigating their own relationships, decisions, and values about maybe those same set of morals or a similar set of principles or a collective set of actions. Um, and that I think that resonates. I think lots of folks have experience, rather they are the person or they've interacted with someone who is so incredibly sure and certain about their opinion, or about how one should act because of that opinion, that it does make it difficult for there to be meaningful communication, or for there to be collaboration in taking action together. And you've talked a little bit about that being counter to some of the values that the Seed COC has, and the capacity to build relationship really being the core of the organization. So can you talk a little bit about if you're not looking to be certain, like if you're not certain, if you're not sure, how do you move forward together? Or how experiences where holding that space or that space you talked about can be functional?
Yes, I can share something about that. So in exploring that pattern or the topic of moral certainty, we went through great lengths of processing experiences that we had in our own lives, and really going through analyzing and acknowledging where we have been actually ourselves enabling the moral certainty in others. So we actually gave it too much space to happen, or we didn't set the boundaries. But also where we ourselves were morally certain and have potentially created harm within others. So this dualistic nature of harm or co-creation of the environment. And from there, we explored how could a pattern look like. We call it a pattern, so a process in the widest sense, that explains a way to navigate it. So what is moral certainty? How can it manifest in a relationship, with a few examples? But then also, how can we work on that? And through doing that, we realized relatively quickly this requires a certain capacity within people to be with themselves and to be with the shadow sides of themselves, or the convictions they have, the beliefs they have, and to critically question in both directions towards their community, but also towards themselves. When are we within a fruitious space, a space where we can create, co-create, where we can grow together? Because conflict is also an enabler of growth, an enabler of intimacy, or of unveiling new layers of intimacy. And when can it hinder? And we came to some examples, such as someone acts in ways that someone else, or let's say I think someone else acts in ways that harms the environment or other people, and I stand that person as selfish and ignorant, and then I say that equals the person. So because they do that, they're selfish and ignorant. That's an example. Not questioning why the person does it and what drives the person to doing this, but actually just stating that argument and not having space to explore deeper into that without saying, it doesn't mean that everything that person does is okay. It's just that I observed this and then I judged it immediately. That would be an example. Or having convictions on how something should or shouldn't be done, criticizing other people for their behavior and assuming their point of view. So it always has a lot to do with equaling behavior with being, and taking lots of assumptions based on your own experiences, up to very severe levels where it then goes into clearly overstepping boundaries, such as psychoanalyzing other people, when then it becomes really dangerous, because the amount of times that like in internet videos, psychoanalysis is done, and you feel like, oh, is that really some professional that has actually judged or has actually the background for it. I think it's so easy to just take assumptions in any direction and not work on that. And that's where we started to work on what are ways to spot moral certainty, and then what are potential solutions, and what is a proactive solution, such as agreeing proactively when we get into a relationship that this is a topic that may come up at some point, and we are committed to work through it, and we're committed to do the self-work. Or reactive solutions, which is then the minute we spot something happening, we invite a healing facilitator or someone who can actually navigate the process. And then we listen to both sides of the argument, as we like to call it, and then just see, okay, what are the grains of truth on both sides, and where's maybe a common ground that we can meet on, and where are hard boundaries. And it often can lead to finding this higher intimacy, of finding that new path together, having learned something together, having grown over it. But it might, at some point, with some people, also lead to having this decision to not proceed with a relationship, and that's fine then as well. I think it's important to acknowledge that it doesn't mean, just because we talk about this topic, it doesn't mean that we always have a solution that, is like a unicorn jumping on a green field. It might mean that there is an end to a relationship, but finding one that is a proper ending, not something that drags on and continues to create harm. And it also trains us in spotting it earlier, which then again is something that helps us to keep the harm done minimally, because moral certainty can be incredibly harmful, as we've experienced it. Not sure if you want to add something, Jennifer.
Yeah, and in my mind, what I'm thinking about are specific situations that can come up. And if the topic is not addressed proactively, I think it can cause people to not want to participate in the group. It can cause hurt feelings. It can cause just there to be things unsaid. And so people become separate from each other. And so by proactively saying these kinds of things, these are examples of what can happen when we're just spending time together. So I want to give a couple of examples, like from my own life. I was in a group of people and in the course of meetings, like one of the people would talk about the fact that circumcision was wrong, for example, like assuming that everybody in the group would also feel that way. And yet, what if there was somebody in the group that didn't feel that way, that did practice circumcision? By one person assuming that they have certain values in common, and then speaking about something that in a way that they're assuming that everybody else must agree, obviously, that can cause, I don't know if harm is quite the right word, but it can cause divisions. And the people who are in the group who are experiencing that as like the person is saying that something that I do or something that I believe is wrong, they're not necessarily going to like bring it up because we don't like to deal with confrontation. But if we talk about this as something that probably will happen and say, how are we going to deal with it, and agree how we're going to deal with it before it comes up, then I think there's a higher chance that it can be resolved. So that's what we did in the CCOC, is we created a pattern, as Vanessa was talking about, of how it can be resolved, so that when someone experiences this and feels uncomfortable, they're hopefully more willing and empowered to talk about it. And then it can be facilitated. so that everyone, it's not that we're trying to convince anybody that one side is right and one side is wrong. It's more that if someone, that everybody has their own agency. We acknowledge that everybody has their own conscience and their own ability to figure out for themselves, according to their own values, what works for them in their lives. And even when something can be as difficult a subject as like circumcision or taking the vaccine or other things that people can have very emotional opinions about, that hopefully we can still be in relationship with each other and find a way forward together in relationships of care.
Thank you for a little bit more of the explanation of both what moral certainty is and looks like, and how it can show up when we gather or attempt to collaborate. I'm so very curious about what the process has been for you, or what your patterning says it could be, in terms of figuring out what are those sticking points. Like, how do you figure out if your group is meeting about real estate justice, that this issue of circumcision is going to potentially cause like deep relational divides that keep you from working together? I think that sounds like very uncommon experience for people who are collaborating or looking to cooperate or form groups, is that we can be very focused on the things that bind us, the things that unite us, and the momentum and the good feeling that can come around that sense of camaraderie or belonging. And we often don't take that extra step of figuring out, okay, well, where are we divided? And where are we maybe going to create pressures against each other's values? And taking the time to explore what could break us up, right? Like, I don't know any band who starts out in the beginning with, okay, here's what we're going to name ourselves, and then here are all the reasons we might break up. Can you speak a little bit to what that has been like for you, or how you're handling that at the CWC, or what that plays into the patterning of how do you go about finding these potential like challenges or threats to your belonging together or your being together?
So we've been together in the CCOC, I think, for 2 years now. And it's really interesting that there hasn't been an issue like this that has been difficult for us yet. And I don't know whether it's the fact that, for me, I do sense it's like, because there's already, we've had this conversation, and I really do trust that if something major comes up, that we will be able to work it out, because we've already established this ground that we all agree that this is important. We all agree that we will honor each other's experiences and each other's values and what each other's conscience tells us, that we haven't had a really sticky issue yet that I can think of. Yeah, so that's what I have to say about that right now. I don't know what you would say, Vanessa.
I think we had smaller conflicts, maybe not around the area of moral certainty, but general conflicts in our group. But what has shown is that the transparency or the safety of being able to talk about something, bringing it to the table immediately. And even if we don't spot it ourselves, someone else in the group is spotting that something is off. And then we talk about it. And we sort it out immediately. We don't let it grow. And again, like the major thing for me is self-responsibility in this. And that sets this group apart from any other group I've worked with before, is that there is no pointing finger in the other direction, but actually we're starting with, well, what's within me right now? How does it feel? What is there? And then we talk about it. And then we see who can own what part of it and what can we do about that. So it's not just moral certainty, but generally conflict that goes there. But one maybe more relatable topic from the past, because I appreciate that maybe, a local group meeting about something else, and then circumcision, right or wrong, as the topic, might not be something everyone may connect with, but something lots of people may connect with is power dynamics at work, and how easily that pans out. And then you have sometimes obvious, but even in the NGO sector, often we talk about non-hierarchy groups, but actually there are hidden hierarchies often. Or in the volunteering sector as well. Sometimes there are hidden hierarchies, and they come out often in resentments either about workload and decision making, or about moral certainty. And yeah, that is a breeding ground for bringing out or for strengthening these power dynamics. Moral certainty is a breeding ground for that, because if we allow each other to be pulled apart or pushed apart by different opinions, and then certain members of the group have more right and others have less right to state their opinions, and instead of really doing the work of getting together and talking about it, and talking about it with humility, and with honesty about, this is what trips me off about you, and then but also owning, like, oh yeah, there is an aspect that, as a grain of truth within, like, what I have done here. That is a game changer, and we don't see that in the natural working world so often. At least I haven't experienced that before. And I was surprised, actually, when I went from the for-profit work sector into the NGO and activism sector, to see, actually, I found it there even more harmful, because it's often much more subtle until it blows out and people get hurt. And why is it even more dangerous? Not just because it's more subtle, but because often marginalized people, or people that have history of abuse, or neurodivergent people, these are attracted to these alternative ways of working, or interbeings, and then you get promised the Holy Land, let's say, in that sense. We do it differently, and then you don't spot that actually it's the wolf in the sheep's disguise there, the wolf in the sheepskin, and you only realize when it's too late and the harm has been done even worse. And it leads to a point of people questioning themselves even more, and up to levels of playing gaslighting that I've observed. And I was shocked, because I genuinely believe that when a group states they are working decolonialized, they are working de-hierarchical, we do sociocratic work, and then it's not factually sociocratic, it's not factually decolonialized, and you just sit there and you've seen it coming since months and months and months, but you kept on, you got the attachment, this attachment to, but this is stated in our values, this has to be true, and we're humans, we all make mistakes, so eventually we will be able to work this through. And you realize, no, it's just the same story repeating itself, but in a different disguise. I found that very interesting, but also very hurtful to experience in the past. And that's why it's so dear to my heart, because I genuinely feel that it requires a lot of work, but we all deserve to have an environment where we can be together despite all differences in opinions and in being. And that we find ways to hold boundaries whilst at the same time navigating these differences in a loving and caring way. So going to no extreme, like finding that middle path together, or just being in a peaceful way, going separate ways, and acknowledging that as it is, what it is, without judging it.
I'm hearing a lot of the importance of being honest about what is, being a really critical element of being able to navigate caring and meaningful, collaborative, effective relationships, while also accepting and contending with the reality that people are people. No matter how much we want to work together, we all have like people stuff that we carry, and we have people patterns that we're kind of born into, and some things we need to unlearn or adjust. And often it's in these collective groups that happens, but it can only really happen if there's like a deep commitment to reality, right? So while we are making differences or navigating our beliefs about what is or not true, we also need to be really honest with the fact of like what's real, in the dynamics that we are navigating this within. So some of the things I heard was it's going to be really important for people to have a space where they can be honest with each other about when something feels off, even if that's difficult to articulate. Having a space where an admission of your role in a conflict is not, doesn't necessarily paint you as the villain, right? Or as the only person who made the problem happen. Something I heard from you was like, who can take responsibility for what part of this? Because none of us live in a vacuum, right? We're not doing this being together on these islands. And that's a big part of what the communities of care are about, coming together to intercare for ourselves and each other. I'm really, really interested to hear a little bit about how do you set up that space for those conversations to happen? You've already mentioned that like naming your values and like writing them down doesn't necessarily mean we have a space where those values are embodied. Or, because we've had these discussions about what the shared values are, or the things we'd like to be accomplishing while we work together, or how we'd like to be working together, that doesn't necessarily very naturally and instantly translate to that being the reality of the space and how you work together. Can you talk a little bit about, and you have also mentioned you didn't have any big conflicts, but can you talk a little bit about how do you go about cultivating a space that embodies those shared values that can hold these differences in values, or can hold the process of being honest about what's not working, or where conflict is coming from?
Yeah, I think I'd like to share about that. I'd like to give an example of where I experienced this was not present. Like Vanessa talked about, being in spaces of nonprofit organizations or activism. I was in a group that was about environmental activism, that was trying to basically do grassroots organizing around climate resilience. And what ended up happening was the person who was like the leader, or the person who had started this organization, in a meeting, what I heard was two women saying that they didn't want to have them visit our area, the leader and his wife, because they realized that they didn't think that they were ready. And they wanted time to prepare, and they wanted to do the work locally and not have to worry about somebody coming into the area. So in the meeting, one person who seemed to have more power was saying that he said, I think we should do this. I think we should have this tour, where the women had already said, we don't feel ready. We don't feel like we should work for this. And what I realized in the meeting was that was not addressed. I didn't feel like there was any space for the women to say again, like, we don't want to go this path. And so I didn't stay in that organization. And how I feel like it's different in a community of care, what we're intending is that if something like that, when something like that happens, we, after the meeting or during the meeting, we can say, this is how I'm feeling right now. How I'm feeling is I've already said that this is not what we feel we want to be doing right now. And how I'm feeling is you're saying it doesn't matter. Like what you think is more important. And that doesn't really work for me. So I would feel completely comfortable saying that with Vanessa or Bjorn, who's in the CTOC, or anyone or any other member. If something were happening that I'm not comfortable with, I'll say it. And I mean, maybe it's already happening and I'm not even noticing it because it's so natural, right? Like we're here together, sharing a house together. And now I'm realizing that actually I have said things like that. Like something was happening that I didn't want to do it in the way that I was being invited to. And I felt totally natural saying it. And it's like, it comes up and it goes. And it's like, not anything even that you even remember afterwards, because it was so natural that you're able to express. I am able to express what I need and what I want to do in the moment. And it just gets navigated by everybody involved, because we all recognize that that's the way we want to be treated. So we treat each other like that. Right. I hope that made sense. And that answered your question, Mistress.
Yeah, I'm curious if you have anything to add, Vanessa.
Yeah, I think for us it's simple because we had the agreed values, but also because we had these experiences that we felt we wanted to work on that. So I appreciate the topic of moral certainty or working around that might not be relevant for every person. For other people, other topics might be relevant. And I'm definitely not reserving right in any of that. That would be morally certain, wouldn't it? I had a very interesting conversation with an activism friend, long year friend of mine. And he stated something that was very interesting, talking about moral certainty and talking about being able to navigate. And that was, yeah, but then we would run into the paradox of tolerance. Because I don't know if you're familiar with the paradox of tolerance, but the idea is if the tolerant would tolerate everyone, even the intolerant would win over and would take over society. And it's an interesting philosophical concept, and it's not talking about whether that's right or wrong and what are the pros and cons of that concept, but the general idea, like I got where he came from, because this is not about saying you navigate moral certainty or love always wins. You always find a way to work together. Like, as mentioned, this is not the unicorn running over a field here. This is hard work. This is hard work on oneself. This is work with humility. And this is boundaries. This is really seeing how can we sit with that equally paradox idea of we can be tolerant, but at the same time, we can stand up to our values. And if necessary, stand up with our life to them. And that is something that for me is still an interesting topic, and I don't have the ultimate answer to it, and maybe I will never get it. But just that idea of what is that gray zone between absolute tolerance or absolute navigation of everything and moral certainty? What is this sweet space where people can have values, but also there are certain things we can agree upon? Like, can we all agree upon, not in all societies, for example, can we agree upon that murdering or killing people is a bad thing? Now, it's not true for all societies. But in most westernized societies, that is the common idea in the general society. But then we live in westernized society that have thrived because of colonialization. So there is a lot of being out of integrity with that value at the same time. So it's it's such a meaty and juicy topic, and that's why I find it interesting to work on it. And I think that draws us in the community of care closer together, because we are interested in these juicy topics and the ones that really require work and that really ask us to tap into the unknown, to navigate paradoxes or juxtapositions, and to do the uncomfortable work on oneself, to really working on a new way. That's how I feel, a new way of us humans interbeing, breaking through the cycles. What is the reality that is outside of everything unknown? And that's because it's outside of the unknown. We can't see it. We can only work towards it.
Thank you for those reflections. Something we're starting to see is that like a really core element of being successful in your capacity to hold space, to navigate moral certainty, but also other sources of conflict, is the regrounding or the building of relationship at the deeper humanity level, at which all of these kind of like issues and topics and identities and all of these other kind of personalized experiences are on top of. And so in many spaces, I think, as you mentioned earlier, when we find disagreement on an issue or a piece of identity or on a perspective, we map that onto the humanity of the person at that deeper layer, rather than doing the hard work of drilling down to what we share, which is that we share a humanity, and that there is a common ground of humanity underneath the places where we disagree. And are we willing to stand on that level of a shared connection and figure out what's on top? Or are we only willing to meet each other at the level of the issue that we're on, so that we are never able to really connect on the shared ground of our humanity? I'm curious about the pattern you mentioned about how to navigate the differing worldviews or the different moralities that are on top of our humanity while maintaining this like deep human relationship that it seems key to your community of care.
Thank you, Mistress. So are you asking basically about the pattern? You would like to hear more about the pattern? Okay. So first of all, what we realized is that the pattern is proactive, that it means that the beginning of the pattern is we have a conversation about this first. So that's part of it. And then what happens is if someone in the community of care is experiencing the negative effects of moral certainty as someone else in the community, then they are invited to bring it up, to communicate about it, to share about it in the community of care. If the community of care is rather large, then we would probably hope to have someone who plays a role of a facilitator. So there would be someone who a person could go to and share about what they're experiencing. And then what we envision happening is that there be a communication, there be facilitated conversation with the person who is acting in a way with moral certainty. And then there would be outcomes of that process. Vanessa, do you want to talk more about what happens then?
Yeah, so the idea is that the person who is feeling affected has no fear of judgment. Like, that's the first part. So they can come, they have no fear of judgment. We find a facilitator. Sometimes that can be someone external, someone with the skills. What's really important here is we can always assume neutrality, but it's something that we need to be really humble about as well. Like, are we really neutral about that topic? Are we really in the state of being able to navigate it from the skills and from our own positions and beliefs as a facilitator? But then it goes into an explorative conversation, potentially with other members of the community. Have you experienced this as well? But also with the acting member with moral certainty. Let's put it that way. So where it has been said, "Oh, that was an act of moral certainty," whether or not that was, we have the conversation with that person, and we always start from the point of everyone's feelings are valid. It's not about the action, but the feeling. Like, feeling something is valid, and we talk about those. Whether the action has been done or not, whether that's a factual proof or not, that doesn't matter for the beginning. But finding a safe ground, because if someone comes to you and accuses you of having done something, it's so easy to get in defense mode. But this is really about acknowledging you're not a bad person. Something has been brought up. How does that feel for you if I share with you that has been brought up? And giving you the space. Then identifying what has been happening, but from all sides, from all points of view. So getting as many angles in as possible in the conversations, and identifying whether that's a one-off or whether that's a repeating behavioral pattern, either within one person or within the entire community, and how severe we see it. So is that something that's even worth convening or acting upon, or is that something that can just be sorted in one conversation and go? Because sometimes it's also misunderstanding, and that might be okay, but it might be something bigger. It might be something that has repeated itself in the past and we've only spotted it now, and then we want to act upon it, or something that is creating emotional or physical harm within people or the environment. And everyone is sharing how they feel, the affected member and the acting member or assumed acting member. And then we explore, where did that come from? And we always assume the good intentions of our people in our community because we've agreed on certain values, right? So based on these values, for us in our community of care, we assume good intentions. There might be other communities where that might not be factually the truth, but in a community of care, by definition, we assume good intentions. We assume care comes first. And then we have have further conversations about what has happened, what can who own about this? How can we change, or how can we resolve the pattern? And asking ourselves what we've learned from that. And then it's all about the paths that we can go down. So we have developed different paths in a pattern. One path could be the acting member, so the one that where we see the pattern of moral certainty or impact, are willing to adjust their behavior, even if they might need support for that, and they can then request that support. And then we offer the support to go on that journey, and we take the learnings, and of course we work with the appreciation that comes out of that, because it requests a lot of personal strength to admit and work on that. We might also figure out there was no pattern, there was no moral certainty, and then we have to work through the effects of that. And why did it come up? Like, is there something to own for whoever brought this up? There might be a path about there was moral certainty and the member sees the pattern, but they do not want to adjust their behavior, or they're not equipped to, and they don't seek support. And then that's a bit harder path, because that would mean we would need to request on how severe it is and how much it impacts our communities if it gets out of integrity with our values. And if so, that's unfortunately a path of leaving the community, because then we're not fit for each other anymore. That's like one of the hardest potential outcomes. And sometimes someone does not see their pattern, so they're going to continue it. So they're just not able to see it at all. I say, like, that's not happening. That's not true here. That's not what is happening. And then this is all about navigating that. Again, with love and with care, and eventually we will get to a path A or path B. So if they don't see it and they don't want to change anything, it's pretty much the same as if they would see it and don't change anything. Because we realized for what a community of care is, it requires a certain readiness for self-reflection, a certain readiness to work on yourself. And if that's not given, I would assume the whole process of building a community of care and the work that it requires to get into it already is a good support to not have that happen, someone not seeing and or not willing to do the self-work. But should that ever happen, that's also like a potential end of relationship or end of collaboration there. But this is all about giving chance to talk about it, and investing in each other first, and then finding a solution. And I have good hopes that actually, if someone does all the work to get into a community of care, they're actually able to work this through to a resolution, and to find a way to navigate what we call the conflicting forces of different worldviews. And it's all about recognizing each other as to where we are, but also recognizing that we're human beings, as you said, Mistress, and that's the nature of it.
I really appreciate that you brought up the role of feelings. I think how seriously to take feelings is a question that I've seen come up in many different kinds of collaborative and organizing spaces. And also the personal accountability piece. So I think that's something that we've witnessed in lots of spaces, is that because of our traumatic experiences, because of the need or the practice of navigating spaces where our humanity isn't held, where we're not held with care, where there isn't the love that we need, we can become very hyper. We can become, what's the word? And so, but like proactive, right? You become really sensitive to things. You're constantly looking for indications that you're being harmed, or you're hyper vigilant is the word I'm thinking of. You become very hyper vigilant. You start looking for signs that others are dehumanizing you. And sometimes you can project that out as you are trying to seek it out. And so it was good to hear that there is space for both of that, both for holding the real impact that people's emotions have in their spaces and how it affects reality, and also needing to be prepared, readily and accountable to work through one's own trauma, or work through some of the outcomes of having lived in that trauma outside of communities of care, to work through that in these communities, to bring that to the community as like a collective act of care, to be working through that rather than necessarily coddling or like accommodating or keeping you in the space where you are at, but bringing you deeper into so that that care can happen on those deeper levels, so that it doesn't become a source of conflict or harm that affects the collective. I'd love to hear anything more that you have about that, on the process of, coming into your own, or finding that you're bringing in a problem, even though you feel like you're finding problems, whether that's come up for you in your community, or what that's looked like, or what resources you have in these patterns or the ways of working together that support people in moving through their own stuff that they're bringing in.
I would say first and foremost, trust your gut feel. The biggest learning I've had in my entire life around that topic is if something happens like this, don't go into your brain, go into your tummy, like trust your gut feel. I've had times where I was trying to fix things in a way, like fix moral certainty based conflicts, huge organizational conflicts, in a way that serves those in power in the organization or serves what I felt was the peace in the organization at the cost of my own well-being. And then realizing down the line that it just empowered the whole pattern more. It enabled the whole pattern. And the outcome was the same. Just with much more pain for everyone involved. And much more pain for other people. Because the outcome was the same. There was a lack of accountability, and that was persistent. And why was it persistent? Because nobody spoke up. Either because there was an attachment to that not being the truth, or just simply not a safe environment to speak. And the whole pattern could have been resolved much quicker had I spoken up in the beginning, what my gut feel told me, which was just, what you're doing there is wrong. Like, this is an act of moral certainty. I see it. It's clear. There are like numerous examples of this now. I've observed it over X amount of times. We have to work with this, independent of your position. But then holding it in a space that allows those feelings to be felt, whilst at the same time holding boundaries for the harm not being perpetuated. Because here's the thing about, there are certain aspects of moral certainty that can then knock on, and that can then make whoever highlights it the villain, like the person trying to resolve the pain, trying to resolve the issue, is then villainized and gaslit into being the actual bad person. And I think that's a pattern that repeats itself so often. And I think lots of environmental activists will now viciously nod as well, because it's like, in the great scheme of things, we can see it on many, many aspects, many layers, but it's that speaking up, creating a safe space where people can speak up, because we acknowledge that, you know, in a society where we are enforced to fit in and forced to be perfect, speaking up is a very uncomfortable act and a very unsafe act. And for some people, even more unsafe than for others. And there is this dual work there about creating a safe space for people, but also asking people to do that work on stepping out of their safety zone and following their gut feel and doing it. I think so. It's not in the COC, but again, like in a bigger scheme of things, a great learning is follow your gut feel. Don't switch on your brain. Don't try to solve everybody else's problems, or don't try to find the comfortable path. The comfortable path for everyone, but find the path that intuitively speaks to you, and walk that path whilst trying to hold space, but also acknowledge your own boundaries in doing so, and other people's boundaries in doing so, because it's hard work.
Yeah, if I could add to that, something that I wanted to add is that I think it's not even so much about feelings, it's about what I experience, and being able to communicate that in the moment. And that feelings are part of everything that I experience. And so, for instance, like, what we realized in the CTOC is that we've all been in spaces where we practice sociocracy, and sociocracy is great. But when you're in a space where it's a value that we're all able to express ourselves authentically, and we're all going to do our best to listen to each other, coming from a place of valuing what the person has to say because we care about the person. When I am in that space and I feel that I really am welcome and free to express myself in the moment of like, what is happening for me right now? What am I experiencing right now? What we found is we don't even use sociocracy anymore. Because sociocracy is meant to provide a structure for sharing power when you're making decisions and when you're working together. But if we're all recognizing that each other's experience is valid, like it's what's happening. I think you also mentioned at one point, Stress, that we're talking about reality. And I really love that. We're talking about reality here, like what each person is experiencing in the moment. When we're able to share that with each other and then take it and co-create something together, based on what each person is experiencing and what each person perhaps wants to have happen or what they think is important in the moment. I mean, something really amazing happens. Like what I've realized in that is that I can be sharing like what's there for me about a project that we're working on. And someone else will bring in something that I hadn't thought about, I hadn't seen. And I can imagine like in the past, if something similar had have happened, I would have gotten defensive or wanted to like argue about why they were wrong or why what I had to say was more important or what I think is more important. But when you're in the space of that, everybody is honestly co-creating the experience together. I don't know. It's just like, it feels very safe. It feels real. It feels different than what I experience in other spaces. Yeah. It feels very powerful. Like I don't want anything else. I don't want any other way of being with people. Yeah.
Yeah, just kind of taking all of that in. Just taking all of that in for a second. Mm. What are some things that you hope people are able to take from this conversation moving forward? And what are some things that you would like people to do with what came up for them out of this conversation?
So I think, first of all, there's no expectation. Like, take away what rings true for you. First of all, yeah. Again, not reserving anything of what I share today. It's like, it's my opinion, it's my experience, and your opinion and experience might be different. And that's fully okay. Also, the notion of we need support until we don't need it anymore. So everything is a practice, and be it sociocracy as a model, be it the pattern to navigate moral certainty that we've written, which we can make accessible to people and will make accessible to people. Use it as long as you need it, And at one point, things will become your being, your nature. And then you won't need it anymore. And there is something about just because a community is practicing something doesn't mean that they're doing it right or doing it in a way that is helpful or doing it complete. That's why we say practicing, whatever we talk about most in our lives is what we work on hardest and is where most of our consciousness, most of our development happens. And that is when things go wrong. And that's part of the process. So again, be it moral certainty, be it the way how organizations are structured, it's all a big learning journey. And things will happen on the way. And some things will be fun and some will be less fun. And we just take those learnings. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Vanessa. One thing I would add is, I think you asked, what would you like people to take away from this? One thing is to consider, I invite people, anybody who's listening to this, to consider, if you're considering entering into a relationship, like with an organization, or you want to deepen a relationship with somebody in your life, or perhaps you're wondering if you want to kind of have some more space in a relationship in your life. Consider what kinds of conversations you might want to have, what kind of questions you might want to engage in with people that you're interested in having a relationship with, like an organization that you're considering volunteering with, like asking about how conflict is dealt with in that organization. What are the practices that are in place? And try and observe whether what people say is in alignment with what you see actually happening in meetings. Because a lot of the time, no matter what the structure is, there can be like hidden in plain sight dynamics of some people having more power than others. And yeah, so that's just what came to me about that invitation, because that's really why I was interested in having a relationship in a community of care, is that I wanted to be able to be in relationship with people with whom I can have these kinds of conversations where it's natural and everybody wants to engage in it.
What are some ways that people can connect with the resources like the pattern that you mentioned, learn more about the COC, or explore being a part of a community of care?
Underneath this video, if you're watching it on YouTube, we'll post links, and we'll post resources, links to resources. You're muted.
Well, thank you so much, Vanessa and Jennifer from the CCOC, for leading us through this conversation on moral certainty, giving us some insight into how your organization is navigating that, as well as inviting folks to step into their power in how they show up in these collective and community spaces to bring about greater peace, care, and love in those environments. And we'll see you next time.